Hello everyone, you know who I am, so I won't introduce myself. But I just wanted to thank you all for coming. My role here tonight is to give you a bit of a vision of what's happening on the planet. We know there's a lot of really terrible things happening, but we also know that there's some pretty exceptional initiatives that are well underway. I learned about a lot of them through preparing this talk tonight. And I'm not going to kid myself thinking that I'm going to be able to share them all with you in the short 20 minutes that I have. So I'm going to highlight some of the ones that impress me. And one of the things that impresses me most is when I start to look back at the history of this land and all the traditional cultures around the world. And I wanted to start really by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Gadigal people, and thank them for our presence. So the story begins when I was in Rishikesh in northern India. And those of you who've been there know it's a saintly little town. And what flows through that village, or that town, is the Ganges River. It starts at the Gangotri, the source in the Himalayas, and it flows down through those mountains. And it meets numerous communities, numerous villages, and Rishikesh is one of the first. And I was there about a decade ago, and I would go down to that river's edge every morning and meditate. I was doing some teacher training over there. And some wonderful things began happening to me. The very first one was that I met my wife. And I also began to see that here was a living culture that saw the earth as a living entity and that river as being sacred. So every morning you would have people from all different denominations coming down and making these sacred holy offerings to that water system. And I began to notice that while some people were making these beautiful offerings of flowers and candles and themselves, that there were also other people that were kind of throwing their garbage into it. And it really made me scratch my head. How could these people do this to this holy water? And I also became aware that the principle of what is upstream affects what flows downstream. So when we were swimming in those waters, a little bit of rubbish would come on us. It was no big deal. But when you go down to Varanasi, anyone who's been there knows that water is no longer pure. And I began to realize this is a great metaphor for our lives. We're all somewhere in that stream. What flows down is all that's unfolded on the planet before we got here. And we're on this earth for a very short period of time, 100 years at best. And we're all given this opportunity where we can actually do something to clear those waters, to rather than take away, make a contribution. And I believe that's the greater purpose to our being here. And so we're going to celebrate tonight that principle of movement and those people who are really initiating change, wanting to leave the world in better shape than when they found it. And I thought I would begin my quest in politics, looking in political leadership and people that were really, driving humanity forward and using higher consciousness as part of their compass. And I looked and looked and looked. Should we just move on to science and technology? I did manage to find one guy. I love him, Jose Mujica. He's the president of Uruguay, who some of you may know. This guy is an absolute living legend. He was labeled as the world's poorest president. And he said, no, I'm the wealthiest president. I have all I need. And his definition of someone who was poor, those people had no end to their need. And he's a very generous man. He was given the equivalent of the White House, but he chose to stay in his one-bedroom house with his wife. And he continues to farm on his land. He gives away 90% of his income to charity. He's also not afraid to speak his mind. When he went to the US and he met President Obama, and he said that your people need to learn a language and stop watching television so much. He also said that he was completely ashamed at the fact that the US primarily, and the global economy spends $2 billion a minute on war and weaponry. So he makes decisions based on how they affect his people, not just how they boost the economy. So there was a wonderful deal where he was offered cheap coal, and he knew that would provide great energy for his people, but at the deleterious impact to the environment, so he knocked it back. He also legalized marijuana, gay marriage. He's managed to reduce poverty from 37% to 11%. So here's a guy who's really doing things differently, but doing things very simply. And I believe he's the highest example of what someone in government should be. Government shouldn't be about what their word states they should do, is control and administer. They should be servants. They should be there in service to their people. Not only people, but to the planet, our mother. And this guy's amazing too, the president of Bhutan. I don't even know how to say his name. I didn't even know how to spell it. But anyway, he believed that what was more important than the gross national product was gross national happiness. And he's got a committee that's formed to make sure that people are thriving, that they're happy. When I look at the way we function in the Western world, I see Australia, it's probably one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Yet, none of us have time. We're all just missing out on the bounty that we have at our fingertips every day because we're always needing to rush somewhere. So I think we need to balance the old world and the new world. And here are two wonderful examples of how this can be achieved. People power. I think this is something which we've been led to believe we don't have. We've lost our sovereignty, we've lost our power, we've lost our commitment to be able to move and drive change because we think we're too small, we're too insignificant. Fortunately, there are wonderful organizations who are helping us to really take back the power and to do this, to really unjumble the world. There's a couple of kids in here. So here's an example of people power in action. There was said to be 400,000 people who marched against climate change in New York very recently. Where was our Prime Minister? He was down the street having a hamburger, and he said it was kind of rubbish and a pointless concept to march against climate change. 400,000 people tended to disagree with him. So when the people speak, the leaders they have to follow, because we are the 99%. This is what we're starting to realize, and this was what really came about through the Occupy movement. And people are understanding that when we organize, when we come together and we express our voice and our opinions, those people who are there to actually serve us, by the people, for the people, have to listen to our views. But if we don't express them, they never will. This also happened in Sydney. We were involved. It happened in Hong Kong. The Occupy movement is pretty incredible. I think what it achieved, you can't see too much effect from it, but what it did is it changed human consciousness. And that's remarkable. And revolution doesn't happen just overnight. It's building here. And some of the things that they did manage to do, the Occupy movement, was force the banks to start to change their policies. For example, when a couple of the banks said that they were going to just increase the fees that you pay by $5 a month, Occupy movement rallied, got people together in banks, started to demonstrate, and then the banks dropped the increase. They also encouraged people to take their money out of the big banks and put it into more regional banks, more than $90 million. So this affects the business of these big banks. This is where we can start to use our bargaining power. Here was another demonstration of human beings coming together in South America. So Avaz, those who are familiar with Avaz literally means voice. And what Avaz has served to do since 2006 is to give 40 million people, that's how many people are in their community, a voice so they can participate in all these very important global issues. And they've been successfully campaigning to change government policy, putting the pressure on the decision makers so they start to radically change things, whether it be saving the Amazon rainforest from development or getting a harmful pesticide banned in Europe that was killing all the bees, or whether it was saving the whales. Literally millions of people petition, and when these are presented to Parliament, they have to pay attention. And then, sure enough, policy changes. And it even happened in Australia here when the Tasmanian forests, these ancient Tarkine forests, were being threatened. The equivalent of as in Australia, Get Up started to put pressure on Harvey Norman. and governments. And then we won, which was amazing. Doesn't take much. We just need to organize. And these are wonderful organizing bodies, and they're giving us all a voice. And all it takes is a click of your email, boom, and you're participating in the game. And there is no planet B. This is it. This is our home. And what came about from India, besides falling in love with my wife, was we had 2 little children. And what having children does to you, besides robbing you of sleep for a couple of years, is it puts things in perspective. You realize you're going to be replaced, that you're not going to be here for very long, and that these little creatures, they become the focus of your world. And so I've really, over the years, started to think, what lives do I want my children to have? And their children. And their children. And I know it's no longer about me anymore. It's about them. And so we really need to start to take care of our children's future, not just our own. And we need to take care of the planet. And everyone's waking up to this understanding now. I know I'm talking to the converted here, so you're a very easy crowd. But the greening of the planet is well underway, not just green smoothies, but everyone's starting to create these green buildings. And this was an idea which was really championed by Patrick Blanc. He's a Frenchman. And he began to notice in Paris how, there wasn't many gardens. So he had the wonderful idea to bring the gardens to the buildings, make them go vertically because there wasn't much horizontal space anymore. And here, people are starting to innovate further. They're bringing, this is the largest green wall in the world. It's about 60 meters long. I think it's in London. And what these green walls serve to do is not make the space just beautiful and habitable and gives it personality. It actually purifies the air. So all the industrial material that goes into making up buildings emits chemicals over time. And these plants help to absorb them so we're not breathing in and then developing all these complications. So there's these wonderful innovations that are happening. Science and technology, there are just billions and billions of incredible things happening. The main one is solar. We're all seeing that we're starting to harvest sunlight. And here's a kind of different way it's being done. I believe this is in Spain. This is a bunch of mirrors that move with the sun, and they're reflecting the sun's energy. So they're not storing it, they're shooting it towards that beam in the center, which then creates heat and then generates electricity and then redistributes that to the grid. So there's remarkable things going on. Solar panels, they're no longer like on the roof, they are the roof. So you don't need to actually get panels anymore. It's just, well, you're making a roof, why not make it out of panels? One of the most impressive technologies that I've seen is radiant energy. Any of you who are familiar with the work of Nikola Tesla, he was an incredible guy. He got a disease as a young child, and it shifted his consciousness dramatically, where he began to see how things worked, and he saw entire inventions come into being in his awareness, and then he thought about recreating them. Absolute visionary. Unfortunately, a lot of his work was funded by JP Morgan. So when he came up with the idea to basically produce radiant energy, which literally just extracts energy from the environment, because we're bathing in electricity right now, he said no one should ever have to pay for it because there's an abundant and limitless supply all around us. But when JP Morgan saw his technology, he said, where do I stick the meter? And buried it. And Nikola Tesla never got to see it come into action, unfortunately. But there is a group in Sweden, a community, that is using, another guy's figured it out based on Tesla's technology, how to create free energy. And there's 6 of them that are operational. He hasn't yet revealed how to go to scale with this, I think because they could piss a few people off, if you know what I mean. So 100% renewable energy, it's happening. We're moving there and we need to get there fast. How do we get there faster? You do it. We're going to talk about that after. But there's lots of companies that are transforming their coal mines into solar mines, solar panels. It's beautiful. There's even solar cars. And now we're starting to get more and more savvy when it comes to eco-literacy. And there are people out there who are really risking their lives to protect and conserve nature. Because there are certain people who don't have a voice, they don't have a vaz. And these are mostly the flora and fauna. And Sea Shepherd has been doing this incredible work, risking their own safety by going into very distant areas and getting in the way of the Japanese whalers primarily. They're also working in the Galapagos where people are doing cutting off shark fins. They pull them up, catch them, cut their fins off, put them back, throw them back in the water, and they go to China to make soup. So these guys are campaigning and working and fighting that fight. And it gets pretty ugly sometimes, but what they're managing to do is there's a vessel that goes into Antarctic protected areas to whale, and then they have to refuel after a period of time. So what Sea Shepherd does is it gets in between so the ships can't refuel. And it makes it harder and harder and harder for them to do their work. It's worth to the Japanese economy in excess of $100 million whaling. And fortunately, for the first time in a very long time, they turned back their ships. Go Sea Shepherd. Love you guys. Here's another cool dude. Mike Reynolds, garbage warrior. He didn't always have that title, but he earned it when a documentary was made on him. And like lots of these stories, these are just people who have a vision, they commit themselves to fulfilling that vision, and they just go about their business and people cotton on. He's been doing this for 40 years. Basically what he's been doing is turning our rubbish into living spaces. So what he does is he takes bottles, he takes tires. There's literally millions and millions of tires that are in these graveyards all over the planet which people don't know what to do with. And one of the tragic things that often happens is people come in and they just burn them, or they catch fire because of the intense heat, creates an enormous amount of pollution. So he discovered a way in which we could utilize these. And the genius of his design was you could ram them full of earth, so they actually start to maintain and hold heat, so it keeps houses hot in winter and cool in summer. And not only that, you get them for free because they're a real pain in the butt to do things with. You have to pay to have them taken away, so people actually deliver to him these free tires, and then he makes houses out of it. And it's happening all over the world. This is an example of a graveyard. And what we can do is we can start to think outside the box and learn how to use what we are polluting the planet with in our favor. We're literally the only species on the planet which pollutes its home. Everyone else, all the other species, have learned to harmonize with the environment. And we're slowly getting there. These houses, he calls them earth ships. They look wacky, but they don't need to look like that. They can look like a regular home. You can see in the distance, that's can at the back, and it's partly rendered at the top. The other one's raw, so when you cover it up, it looks beautiful. And these sell for a pretty penny. And the thing is, they're made in such a way where there's no loss of power, and all the water systems, the sewerage systems, they're all working to feed the gardens, they extract the water. So it's a closed loop system, which is exceptional. And you can run whatever you want in them, televisions, etc. And the electricity bill is about $100 a year. Incredible. Here's what it looks like. Looks pretty sweet. And Patagonia and lots of other companies are starting to innovate. Patagonia did this really great thing. They understood that about 12 million tons of old clothes was being dumped every year as things went out of fashion or got old. So they said to people, don't buy our stuff, bring back yours and we'll buy it off you, or we'll find a great home for it. And what they've been doing for a long time is making clothes out of recycled material. There are billions of water bottles that get used annually, and one plastic bottle lives for about 1,000 years, so it's longer than any of us. So they've got greater longevity. But what we can do is we can recycle them. What you do is you put it in a machine, the machine heats it, it cuts it up into little pieces, heats it, it turns into this gooey mass, it comes out as like a fiber, and then we make clothes out of it. Why the hell aren't we all doing that? We can, and these guys are leading the way. And one t-shirt has about 10 bottles of water in it. And there's lots of innovations happening as well within construction. There's an Italian cement company which has figured out how to extract pollution from the atmosphere. And other companies have figured out how to extract pollution, purify it, and then pump out clean air. And you might think that's not a big problem for us, but I visited a place in China where they haven't seen the sky in over 6 years. So there's literally children who don't know what the stars look like, don't know what a blue sky looks like. And because of the nature of our biosphere, and we've got all these winds, literally we're breathing in fumes from Mexico that were there yesterday will be with us today. So we all need to start to think in innovative ways. Vandana Shiva, she is someone who I just bow down to. She's a beautiful, beautiful woman from India. And she has been campaigning for food sovereignty for a long time, taking on the big multinationals, taking on Monsanto, or Monsanto as I like to call it. And she's understood that they're trying to manipulate our food systems. What they're doing is modifying the seed, not so they can feed the masses. There's no problem with feeding the masses. Just look at the Dachniks, which are a group of villages in Russia that have over 18.8 million farms, rural farms. You're basically given a plot of land, and then you get to cultivate and use that land. And this is how Russia gets about 50% of its agriculture. And it equates to about $30 billion a year, just from people growing foods. And that's how they survived Stalin, that era, because they had this food supply. So there's no problem with feeding the world. What Monsanto wants to do is make that into intellectual property. Once you modify the seed, it can't reproduce, then people have to buy your seed, and you own that food. And this is very dangerous, as we all know. And so Vandana Shiva has been campaigning for a long time. And a lot of people have been giving their support, including Avaz and lots of other people throughout France where GMOs are banned. Not in this country yet. And there is a seed bank in Norway where they've understood how precious seed is. And so they're storing all the seeds of the world there under high security in case one day something ever goes wrong. Isn't that beautiful to know that someone has that foresight? Incredible. And we live in an area where there's not-for-profit, social entrepreneurs, a social enterprise, crowdfunding. When you start to look at it, it's just remarkable. It makes your heart swell. And microfinancing is something that is quite exceptional. It began with this guy here, Muhammad Yunus. He's a Nobel Prize-winning laureate. He got the Peace Prize. And he began experimenting back in 1976, I believe, with trying to liberate the rural people from their poverty. He understood they had this enormous potential, had this enormous talent and know-how, but they had no money in order to get the startup capital they needed to create businesses. So he began experimenting with microfinancing, where he would loan people small amounts of money, and 95% of their borrowers are actually women. They're the ones that, rule all the money in India. And so they're finding that just by loaning small amounts of money, these people are running these businesses and then paying the money back. And it's at very little to no interest. And this is something which Kiva is also doing. They've loaned in excess of $168 million. They've got over 1 million donors throughout the world, 1.2 million, and it's growing. And what you do is you can choose to lend someone $25 or more. And what that person does, they have to go through a testing process. And then if they're deemed to be suitable, they need to be low-income earners. And then they can go out and create a business. And 70% of the people who actually donate the money choose, once it's been paid back, to reinvest it. People just like doing good. Social enterprise is huge. These are basically businesses that are for profit, but they're there to serve a mission, not a profit goal. So there is space for both. And the Rolling Jubilee is doing some incredible things. They're bailing people out of debt, basically. They've raised $700,000, but what they've done with that is they're buying up debt. And the debt in the US is off the charts. It's not far off in this country either. And that debt is bought at pennies on the dollar. So they bought over $100 million worth of debt, and they don't follow up that debt. They just trash it. So those people just lose their debt, and everyone's happy. So these guys are great too. Who gives a crap? These guys do. They became aware that 2.5 billion people on our planet, so almost over 40% of the people, don't have access to a toilet. And 2,000 people die per day because of poor sanitation. And these guys had a real problem with that. So they thought, how can we do something about this? So they decided to come up with toilet paper, There's nothing special about it. But what they do is they give away 50% of their income to a charity which goes to create and build toilets and create sanitation. Incredible what they've done. So every time you go to the toilet, you're literally improving someone's life. Who would have thought? I want to go more. I'm going to eat some curry. Tom's is also doing great things. You've probably all heard of these guys before. They've got a one-for-one policy. So they say, you buy shoes from me, we'll buy shoes for these people. You buy glasses from me, we'll restore eyesight. You buy coffee from us, we're going to give clean drinking water to someone for a week. And at the last count, they have restored over 250,000 people's eyesight. Incredible. And they've given over 65 million pairs of shoes. And it goes to show that we can really harmonize economics with doing good things for the community and for the global family. Crowdfunding's another whopper. We used to think we had to get money from the banks. Fortunately, we don't anymore. There are just scores and scores of crowdfunding sites, and these have just skyrocketed in the past 3 years. It's gone up over 1,000% in the last 5 years. And what crowdsourcing is, or crowdfunding is basically you put up a project, people like your project, they donate, and then you can fulfill your project. And it can be anything. One guy, wanted to make a sandwich. So he raised 20 grand to make a sandwich. Crazy. What people will do for a laugh. But other people are creating, technologies, building homes, feeding the poor, doing all these sorts of things. And this is said to skyrocket. It adds about $65 billion to the economy, to the global economy fundraising. And by 2020, it's estimated to add $550 billion to the economy and a perceived value as $3.2 trillion. So crowdfunding is on the way up. So this is where we can really come together. Money can become our dearest friend. And our greatest power is, I think, our community. This is the greatest power that we have. We have several. I think it's the power to work together. In Africa, there's an expression that if you want to go fast, then go alone. If you want to go long, go together. And this is what we need to learn to do. And there's that story of the Western anthropologist who was visiting an African village. And she saw the children playing together. And she said, okay, I'm just going to run a little experiment. And she showed them this beautiful bowl of fruit. And she placed it up under a tree. And she said, the first one to the basket gets to eat the fruit. And so all the African children held hands and then ran as one. And then when she got there, she said, why did you do that? Why didn't one of you run up? She said, and the children said, Ubuntu. And they said, what's that? And it means that we live as one, that we're all connected. It's that principle of community, giving, living, and sharing. And it's a beautiful thing. And that's the only way that we're ever going to get by, because we are a global community. We're one family. It's such a mistake or an error to say, you're Japanese, you're North Korean, you're Palestinian, you're atheist, you're Hindu, you're a Jain. These are all false labels. We're all human beings. We're all one family, the human family. And so the more we start to embody that principle of community, Ubuntu, the better we're going to be. And I believe that what really gets us stuck is what Charles Eisenstein was talking about, money. It's really got us all by the short and curlies, hasn't it? So much of our life just revolve around having to get it and have it and what to do with it. And you look back and you think, what were the Indigenous Australians doing for 50,000 years? What was their economy? They didn't have one. It's something that we've invented. We've invented this thing called money, and we're all beholden to it. And the money, believe it or not, is basically distributed or created by the Federal Reserve, which gets its money from the World Bank, which is a privately owned enterprise. About 30 or 40 leading families own the World Bank, and they control the finance. And the only way to really stop this is to dismantle the currency. It's been done before, actually, in the US. They were using tally sticks. And what a government can do is issue its own currency. You don't need to borrow because, as we've learned, that money has debt attached with it. If a country like ours issues its own currency, there's no more debt. And so our lives will improve dramatically, but that's going to be a long way off. I believe in Nutopia. Utopia is a bit far off. We've got to start with Nutopia first. So what we saw was an opportunity to start to create our own currency. The government's not going to do it. So Tim and I thought, how do we get people out there to participate in that giving, in sharing? And so that's when we came up with conscious currency. And this little thing in your hands has the capacity to potentially change the world. Something that we're releasing today. It's been in the works for several years. 2, actually. We did a first run, didn't like it, we thought, no, we can't release that. So it took us a whole new year to do it again. And what this is designed to do is get us thinking outside of ourselves. Tim and I noticed that as we started to launch the Do Good Challenge, which happened about a year or so ago, we would give people a bunch of money, $500, and say, go and do something nice with it in the world. And people were just struck as to what the hell they could do. And they were coming back having done nothing sometimes. And for me, what it began to illustrate was how much we tend to think more of our own needs. We've become very insular. And I believe that one of the things that we're basically biologically engineered for is love. This is the hormone oxytocin, which some of you might be familiar with. It's in your body at peak levels during orgasm, laughter, meditation, when women give birth, when women breastfeed. It's what bonds the baby to the mother for life. And so some leading researchers have found that human beings have the capacity to produce this hormone of love. And believe it or not, we do it during marriage, we do it when we give. And the thing is, not only do you get an oxytocin hit when you give something, the person who receives also gets it. And the most radical thing is that someone who witnesses that giving also receives it. And oxytocin is a hormone that just keeps giving. The more you learn to secrete it and produce it and activate it within your system, the easier it becomes to produce it. It's not like dopamine, where you have a bit of chocolate, boom, you're getting a dopamine hit, or when you sort of rush around, you're getting a dopamine hit. That has a law of diminishing returns attached to it. You need more and more of that thing to still get that high. So there's so many things that can be gained from exercising human kindness. And I believe that's what keeps us alive. That's when we feel good. As a people, we've been cut off from that, largely because of the setup of our economy and how hard we have to work and how we have to compete. Communities have dissolved. But when we start to connect with a community, something returns. That richness in our heart, that richness in our minds. And this has really happened for me since starting the Conscious Club. I don't know why we started, I can't even remember now. But I've really been tapping into a community of people that have like minds and really want to explore life and things which aren't popular but are becoming very popular. So as we go forward, I'm going backwards, sorry. We come to what can we do? Well, you can do whatever you like, but I'd like you to realize that, where you are is on that river. We're all standing at a point on the river. We're here, we have the capacity to direct the change or to just go with the flow of what's been set before us. And you're charged tonight with the potential to go out and actually do something good in the world. The buck starts with you. You are literally the first recipients of this currency. Is Rio in the room tonight? If he is, can he stand up and come up here, my friend? So something like this just doesn't come out of thin air. You know, it required a little bit of funding. So my dear friend Rio offered to fund the whole project. I told him about it. He's bloody tall. And stay here, mate. So anyway, I told him about the project. He goes, Gaz, love it. Tell me what you need. And I said, well, don't know. We're just going to try and get someone to manufacture it. And he said, all right, tell me how much you need. I'll write the check. And I said, it's probably going to be pretty expensive. He said, doesn't matter. Just write me a check. I love the idea. And so here's a guy who embodies that understanding that he has a little bit more. He's not a squillionaire, but he just does great things. So what I wanted to present to you, my friend, was number one.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, mate.
Thank you.
Go ahead. All right. And so we can all become champions of the gifting economy. Each one of these has a unique code. It has a hashtag. And our first printing is 3,000. And what this allows you to do is keep track of where your coin is going. You just make note of it. Even in your Instagram account, you'll hash it and you can search it later. You can look back to the photo and you can see what happened to it from the person that you gave it to and what they did with it and what they did with it and so on and so forth. This thing has the potential to take us out of ourselves and do an enormous amount of good. There's no limit to our creativity and how much we can shift, how much we can change. And basically, I want to see what you guys can do. We've come up with this. Now, will you be part of the army? If you take one of these, I'd like you to commit to doing something with it. And if you don't want to do that, then leave it here. And we'll give it to people who are willing to take on that challenge. So, from me, I say, you're brilliant and the earth is hiring. We can all make a difference. The main thing that does it is this: money. It's both the thing which oppresses many people, but it can also lead to our liberation. We need to think very carefully about how we spend our dollars, because the way the economy is set up, it's supply and demand. If people say we no longer want that, all those corporations will say, okay, let's go on to the next thing. And so each one of your choices, this is why we call this the Conscious Club, because we believe we have a responsibility to awaken people, to give them awareness and charge them with information with which they can put into action. So I hope that we can move forward from Gandhi's great vision, which was be the change you wish to see in the world. I believe we need to go one step further and initiate the change we wish to see in the world. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me.